We are starting at Chapter 4 of Shadow over Innsmouth by H.P. Lovecraft. I can hardly describe the mood in which I was left by this harrowing episode. An episode at once mad and pitiful, grotesque and terrifying. The grocery boy had prepared me for it, yet the reality left me none the less bewildered and disturbed. Puerile though the story was, old Zadok's insane earnestness and horror had communicated to me a mounting unrest which joined with my earlier sense of loathing for the town and its blight of intangible shadow. The hour had grown perilously late. My watch said 7:15 and the Arkham bus left town square at 8, so I tried to give my thoughts as neutral and practical a cast as possible. Meanwhile, walking rapidly through the deserted streets of gasping roofs and leaning houses towards the hotel where I had checked my valise and would find my bus. Studying the grocery youth's map and seeking a route I had not traveled before, I chose Marsh Street instead of State for my approach to Town Square. Near the corner of Fall Street, I began to see scattered groups of furtive whisperers, and when I finally reached the square, I saw that almost all the loiterers had congregated around the door of the Gilman house. It seemed as if many bulging, watery, unblinking eyes looked oddly at me as I claimed my valise in the lobby, and I hoped that none of the unpleasant creatures would be my fellow passengers on the coach. The bus, rather early, rattled in with 3 passengers somewhat before 8, and an evil-looking fellow on the sidewalk muttered a few indistinguishable words to the driver. It appeared in very bad luck. It appeared in very bad luck. There had been something wrong with the engine. Despite the excellent time made from Newburyport, the bus could not complete the journey to Arkham. No, it could not possibly be repaired at night. Nor was there any other way of getting transportation out of Innsmouth, either to Arkham or elsewhere. Sergeant was sorry, but I would have to stop over at the Gilman. Probably the clerk would make the price easy for me, but there was nothing else to do. Almost dazed by the sudden obstacle and violently dreading the fall of night in this decaying and half unlighted town, I left the bus and re-entered the hotel lobby, where the sullen, queer-looking night clerk told me I could have room 428 on next the top floor. Large, but without running water, for $1. Despite what I had heard of this hotel in Newburyport, I signed the register, paid my $1, let the clerk take my valet, and followed that sour, solitary attendant up 3 creaking flights of stairs, past dusty corridors, which seemed wholly devoid of life. My room, a dismal rear one with only 2 windows and bare, cheap furnishing, overlooked a dingy courtyard otherwise hemmed in by low, deserted blocks. And commanded a view of a decrepit, westward stretching roofs, with a marshy courtside beyond. At the end of the corridor was a bathroom, a discouraging relic with ancient marble bowl, tin tub, faint electric light, and musty wooden paneling around all of the plumbing fixture. As twilight deepened, I turned on one feeble electric bulb over the cheap iron-framed bed and tried as best I could to read. It was advisable to keep my mind wholesomely occupied, for it would not do to brood over the abnormalities of this ancient, light-shadowed town while I was still within its border. The insane yarn I had heard from the aged drunkard did not promise very pleasant dreams, and I felt I must keep the image of his wild, watery eyes as far as possible from my imagination. Another thing that disturbed me was the absence of a bolt on the door to my room. One had been there, as marks clearly showed, but there was signs of recent removal. No doubt it had become out of order, like so many other things in this decrepit edifice. In my nervousness, I looked around and discovered a bolt on my clothes press, which seemed to be of the same general size, judging from the marks, as the one formerly on the door. To gain a partial relief from the general tension, I busied myself by transferring this hardware to the vacant place, with the aid of a handy 3-in-1 device, including a screwdriver, which I kept on my keyring. The bolt fitted perfectly, and I was somewhat relieved when I knew that I could shoot it firmly upon retiring. There were adequate bolts on the 2 lateral doors to the connecting rooms, and these I proceeded to fashion. I did not undress, but decided to read till I was sleepy, and then lie down on my coat. Collar and shoes off. Let me reread that. I did not undress, but decided to read till I was sleepy, and then lie down, with only my coat, collar, and shoes off. Taking a pocket flashlight from my valet, I placed it in my trousers so that I could read my watch if I woke up later in the dark. Drowsiness, however, did not come, and when I stopped to analyze my thoughts, I found to my disquiet that I was really unconsciously listening for something which I dreaded but could not name. At length, feeling a fatigue which had nothing of drowsiness in it, I bolted the newly outfitted hall door, turned off the light, and threw myself down on the hard, uneven bed, coat, collar, shoes, and all. In the darkness, every faint noise of that night seemed magnified, and the flood of doubly unpleasant thoughts swept over me. I was sorry I had put out the light, yet was too tired to raise and turn it on again. Then, after a long dreary interval, and prefaced by a fresh creaking of stairs and corridor, there came a soft, damnably unmistakable sound which seemed like a malign fulfillment of my apprehension. Without the least shadow of a doubt, the lock on my hall door was being tried. Cautiously, furtively, tentatively, with a key. The change in the menace from the vague premonition to my immediate reality was a profound shock, and fell upon me with the force of a genuine blow. It never once occurred to me that the fumbling might have been a mere mistake. Malign purpose was all I could think of. and I kept deathly quiet, awaiting the would-be intruder's next move. After a time, the cautious rattling ceased, and I heard the room to the north entered with a passkey. Then the lock of the connecting door to my room was softly tried. The bolt held, of course, and I heard the floor creak as the prowler left the room. After a moment, there came another soft rattling, and I knew that the door to the south of me was being entered. Again, a furtive trying of the bolt-connected door, and again, a receding creak. This time, the creaking went along the hall and down the stairs, so I knew the prowler had realized the bolted condition of my doors and was giving up his attempt for a time. But one thing to do was to get out of that hotel alive as quickly as I could, and through some channel other than the front stairs and lobby. Rising softly and throwing my flashlight on the switch, I sought to light the bulb over my bed in order to choose and pocket some belongings for a swift, voiceless flight. Nothing, however, happened, and I saw the power had been cut. So, filling my pockets with the flashlight's aid, I put on my hat and tiptoed to the window and considered chances of a descent. Despite the state safety regulations, there was no fire escape on this side of the hotel, and I saw that my windows commanded only a sheer 3-story drop to the cobbled courtyard. On the right and left, however, some ancient brick business blocks abutted on the hotel, their slant roofs coming up to a reasonable jumping distance from my 4th-story level. To reach either of these lines of buildings, I would have to be in the room 2 doors from my own, in one case on the north, and in the other case to the south. My mind instantly set to working calculations what chances I had of making this transfer. Just need a drink of water. Okay, I'm back. Let's see. First, I reinforced my own outer door by pushing the bureau against it, little by little, in order to make a minimum of sound. Then, gathering from the grocery boy's map that the best route out of town was southward, I glanced first at the connecting door on the south side of the room. It was designed to open in my direction, hence I saw, after drawing the bolt and finding other fastenings in place, it was not a favorable one for forcing. Accordingly, abandoning it as a route, I cautiously moved the bedstand against it to hamper any attack which might have been made on it later from the next room. The doors on the north was hung to open away from me, and this, though a test, proved it to be locked or bolted on the other side. I knew what must be my route if I could gain the roofs of the buildings in Payne Street and descend successfully to the ground level. I might perhaps dart through the courtyard in the adjacent or opposite buildings to Washington or Bates, or else emerge in Payne and edge around the southward to Washington. In any case, I would aim to strike Washington somehow and get quickly out of Town Square region. My preference would be to avoid pain since the fire station there might be open all night. I was irros- sorry. Irresolutely speculating on when I had a better attack the northward door and on how I could least audibly manage it, when I noticed that the vague noises underfoot had given place to a fresh and heavier creaking on the stairs. A wavering flicker of light showed through my transom, and the boards of the corridor began to groan with a ponderous load. Muffled sounds of possible vocal origin approached, and at length, a firm knock came to my outer door. For a moment, I simply held my breath and waited. Eternities seemed to elapse, and the nauseous, fishy odor of my environment seemed to mount suddenly and spectacularly. Then the knocking was repeated continuously, and with growing insistence. I knew that the time for action had come, and forthwith drew the bolt of the northward connecting door, bracing myself for the task of battering it open. The knocking waxed louder, and I hoped that its volume would cover the sound of my efforts. At least beginning my attempt, I lunged again and again at the thin paneling with my left shoulder, heedless of shock or pain. Finally, the connecting door gave in, but with such a crash that I knew those outside must have heard. Instantly, the outside knocking became a violent battering, while keys sounded ominously in the hall doors of the rooms on both sides of me. Rushing through the newly opened connection, I succeeded in bolting the northerly hall door before the lock could be turned. But even as I did so, I heard the hall door of the third room, the one from whose window I had hoped to reach the floor below, being tried with a passkey. For an instant, I felt absolute despair, since my trapping in a chamber with no window egress seemed complete. Then, with a dazed automaton, I made for the next connecting door and performed the blind motion of pushing at it with an effort to get through. Sheer fortunate chance gave me my reprieve, for the connecting door before me was not only unlocked but actually ajar. In a second, I was through, and had my right knee and shoulder against a hall door, which was visibly opening inward. My pressure took the opener off guard, for the thing shut as I pushed, so that I could slip the well-conditioned bolt as I had done with the other door, and I gained this respite. As I gained this respite, I heard the battering at the two other doors abate, while a confused clatter came from the connecting door I had shielded with the bedstead. Evidently, the bulk of my assailants had entered the southwardly room and were massing in a lateral attack. But at the same moment, a passkey sounded in the next door to the north, and I knew that a nearer peril was at hand. The northward connecting door was wide open, but there was no time to think about checking the already turning lock in the hall. All I could do was to shut the bolt against the connecting door as well as its mate in the opposite side, pushing a bedstead against the one and a bureau against the other, and moving a washstand in front of the hall door. I must, I saw. Trust to such makeshift barriers to shield me till I could get out the window and on the roof of Payne Street block. But even in this acute moment, my chief horror was something apart from my immediate weakness of my defense. I was shuddering because not one of my pursuers, despite some hideous panting, grunting, and subdued barking at odd intervals, was uttering an intelligible vocal sound. Okay, I actually need to take a very short break to go fetch some more water. I'll be back in just a minute. I am back. Sorry about that. Now let's see here. We had just... yes. We ended with vocal sound. As I moved the furniture and rushed towards the windows, I heard a frightful scurrying along the corridor to the room north of me and perceived the southward battering had ceased. Plainly, most of my opponents were about to concentrate against the feeble connecting door, which they knew must open directly on me. Outside, the moon played on the ridgepole of the block below, and I saw that the jump must be desperately hazardous because of the steep surface on which I must land. The clatter at the northwardly connecting door was now terrific, and I saw that the weak paneling was beginning to splinter. Obviously, the besiegers had brought some ponderous object to play as a battering ram. The bedstead, however, still held firm, so that I had at least a faint chance of making good my escape. As I opened the window, I noticed that it was flanked by heavy, velourous draperies, suspended from a pole by brass rings, and also that there was a large projecting hatch for the shutters on the exterior. Seeing a possible means of avoiding the dangerous jump, I yanked at the hangings and brought them down, pole and all, and then quickly hooking two of the rings from the shutter in the shutter catch and flinging the drapery outward. The heavy folds reached fully to the abutting roof, and I saw that the rings and catch would likely bear my weight. So, climbing out of the window and down the improvised rope ladder, I left behind me forever the morbid and horror-infested fabric of the Gilman house. I landed safely on a loose slate of the steep roof and succeeded in gaining the gaping black skylight without a slip. The place inside was ghoulish looking, but I was past minding such impressions and made at once for the staircase revealed by my flashlight. After a hasty glance at my watch, which showed it the hour to be 2 a.m., the steps creaked, but seemed tolerably sound, and I raced down past a barn-like second story to the ground floor. The desolation was complete, and only echoes answered my footfalls. The hall inside was black, and when I reached the opposite end, I saw that the street door was wedged open, immovably shut. Resolved to try another building, I groped my way towards the courtyard, but stopped short when close to the doorway. Or, out of an opened door in the Gilman house, a large crowd of doubtful shapes was pouring. Lanterns throbbing in the darkness and horrible croaking voices exchanging low cries in what was certainly not English. Their features were indistinguishable, but their crouching, shambling gait was abominably repellent, and worst of all, I perceived that one figure was strangely robed and unmistakably surmounted by a tall tiara of a design altogether too familiar. Again groping towards the street, I opened a door off the hall and came upon an empty room with closed... closely shuttered but sashless windows. Fumbling in the rays of my flashlight, I found I could open the shutters, and in another moment had climbed outside and was carefully closing the aperture in its original manner. I walked rapidly, softly, and close to the ruined houses at Bates Street. I drew into a yawning vestibule while two shambling figures crossed in front of me, but was soon on my way again and approached the open space where Elliott Street obliquely crosses Washington at the intersection of South. Though I had never seen the space, it had looked dangerous to me on the grocery youth's map. Since the moonlight would have free play there was no use trying to evade it, or any alternate course would involve detours of possibly disastrous visibility and delaying effect. The only thing to do was cross it boldly and openly, imitating the local shamble of the Innsmouth folk as best I could, and trusting that no one, or at least no pursuer of mine, would be there. Just how fully the pursuit was organized, and indeed, just what purpose might be, I could form no idea. There seemed to be unusual activity in the town, but I judged that the news of my escape from the Gilman had not yet spread. The open space was, as I had expected, strongly moonlit, but my progress was unimpeded, and no fresh sound arose to hint that I had been spied. Glancing around me, I involuntarily let my pace slacken for a second to take sight of the sea, gorgeous in the burning moonlight at the street's end. Far out beyond the breakwater was the dim, dark line of Devil's Reef. Then, without warning, I saw intermittent flashes of light on the distant reef. My muscles tightened for panic flight. Held in only by a certain unconscious caution and half-hypnotic fascination. And to make matters worse, there now flashed forth from the lofty cupola of the Gilman house, which loomed up to the northeast behind me, a series of analogous, though differently spaced gleams, which could be nothing less than an answering signal. I now bent to the left around the ruinous green, still gazing towards the ocean as it blazed in the spectral summer moonlight, and watching the cryptical flashings of those nameless, unexplainable beacons. It was then that the most horrible impression of all was borne in upon me, the impression which destroyed my last vestige of self-control and sent me running frantically southward past the yawning black doorways and fishy staring windows of that deserted nightmare street. For at a closer glance, I saw that the moonlight waters between the reef and the shore were far from empty. They were alive with a teeming horde of shapes swimming inward towards town. My frantic running ceased before I had covered a block, for at my left begun to hear something like a hue and cry of organized pursuit. There were footsteps and guttural sounds, and a rattling motor wheezed south along Federal Street. In a second, all my plans were utterly changed. For if the southward highway were blocked ahead of me, I must clearly find another egress from Innsmouth. I paused and drew into a gaping doorway, reflecting how lucky I was to have left the moonlit open space before the pursuers came down the parallel street. Then I thought of the abandoned railway to Rowley, whose solid line of ballasted, weed-grown earth still stretched off to the northwest from the crumbling station on the edge of the river gorge. There was just a chance that the townsfolk would not think of that. Need to take another drink. Drawing inside the hall of my deserted shelter, I once more consulted the grocery boy's map and with the aid of the flashlight. The immediate problem was how to reach the ancient railway, and I now saw that the safest course was ahead to Babson Street, then west to Lafayette, there edging around but not crossing an open space homologous to the one I had traversed, and subsequently back northward and westward in zigzagging line through Lafayette, Bates, Adams, and Bank Street, the latter skirting of the river gorge to the abandoned and dilapidated station I had seen from my window. My reason for going ahead to Babson was that I wished neither to recross the earlier open space, nor begin my westward course along the cross street as broad as south. I crossed the street to the right-hand side in order to edge around into Babson as inconspicuously as possible. In Babson Street, I clung as closely as possible to the sagging, uneven buildings, twice pausing in a doorway as the noises behind me momentarily increased. The open space ahead of me shone wide and desolate under the moon, but my route would not force me to cross it. During my second pause, I began to detect a fresh distribution of the vague sounds, and upon looking cautiously out from the cover behind a motor car darting across the open space bound outward along Elliott Street, as I watched, choked by a sudden rise in the fishy odor, after a short abatement, I saw a band of uncouth, crouching shapes lopping and shambling in the same direction, and knew that this must be the party guarding the Ipswich Road, since that highway forms an extension of Elliott Street. Two of the figures I glimpsed were in voluminous robes, and one wore a peaked diadem which glistened whitely in the moonlight. The gait of this figure was so odd that it sent a chill through me. For it seemed that the creature was almost hopping. When the last of the band was out of sight, I resumed my progress, darting around the corner into Lafayette Street and crossing Elliott very hurriedly, lest stragglers of the party be still advancing along the thoroughfare. I did hear some croaking and clattering sounds off towards Town Square, but accomplished the passage without disaster. My greatest dread was in recrossing Broad and moonlit South Street, with its seaward view, and I had nerved myself for the ordeal. Someone might easily be looking, and possible Elliott Street stragglers could not fail to glimpse me from either of the 2 points. At the last moment, I decided I had better slacken my trot and make the crossing as before in a shambling gait of an average Innsmouth native. I had not quite crossed the street when I heard a muttering band advancing along Washington from the north. As they reached the broad open space, where I had my first disquieting glimpse of the moonlit water, I could see them plainly, only a block away, and was horrified by the bestial abnormality of their faces, and the dog-like subhumanness of their crouching gait. One man moved in a positively simian way, with long arms frequently touching the ground, while another figure, robed and tiara'd, seemed to progress in an almost hopping fashion. I judged this party to be the one I had seen in the Gilman courtyard, the one therefore most closely on my trail, and some of the figures turned to look in my direction. I was transfixed with fright, yet managed to preserve the casual, shambling gait I had assumed. To this day, I do not know whether they saw me or not. If they did, my stratagem might have deceived them, for they passed on across the moonlit space without varying their course. Meanwhile, croaking and jabbering in some hateful, guttural patois I could not identify. Once more in the shadow, I resumed my former dog trot, past the leaning and decrepit houses that stared blankly into the night. Having crossed to the western side, I rounded the nearest corner to Bate Street, where I kept close in the buildings on the southern side. At least, I saw the ancient arcade station, or what was left of it, and made directly for the tracks that started from its furthest end. Getting another drink. The rails were rusty but mainly intact, and not more than half of the ties have rotted away. Walking or running on such a surface was very difficult, but I did my best, and on the whole made very fair time. For some distance, the line kept on along the gorge's brink, but at length I reached the long covered bridge where it crossed the chasm at a dizzying height. The condition of this bridge would determine my next step. If humanly possible, I would use it. If not, I would have to risk more street wandering and take the nearest intact highway bridge. The vast, barn-like length of the old bridge gleamed spectacularly in the moonlight, and I saw that the ties were safe for at least a few feet within. Entering, I began to use my flashlight, and was almost knocked down by a cloud of bats that flapped past me. About halfway across, there was a perilous gap in the ties, which I feared for a moment would halt me, but in the end I risked a desperate jump, which fortunately succeeded. I was glad to see moonlight again when I emerged from the macabre tunnel. The old tracks crossed River Street at a grade, and at once veered off into a region increasingly rural, and with less and less of the Innsmouth's abhorrent fishy odor. Here the dense growth of weeds and briars hindered me, and cruelly tore at my clothes, but I was none the less glad that they were there to give me concealment in case of peril. I knew that much of my route must be visible from the Rowley Road. The marshy region began very shortly with the single track on a low, grassy embankment. Then came a sort of island of higher ground, where the line passed through a shallow, open cut choke. A shallow, open cut, choked with bushes and brambles. I was very glad of this partial shelter, since at this point the Rowley Road was uncomfortably near, according to my window view. Just before entering the cut, I glanced behind me and saw no pursuers. The ancient spires and roofs of decaying Innsmouth gleamed lovely and ethereally in magic yellow moonlight, and I thought of how they must have looked in the old days, before the shadow fell. Then, as my gaze circled inland towards the town, something less tranquil arrested my notice and held me immobile for a second. What I saw, or fancy I saw, was a disturbing suggestion of undulant motion far to the south, a suggestion which made me conclude that a very large horde must be pouring out of the city along the level Ipswich Road. The distance was great. I could distinguish nothing in detail, but I did not at all like the look of that moving column. All sorts of unpleasant conjectures crossed my mind. I thought of those very extreme Innsmouth type, said to be hidden in crumbling, centuried warrens near the waterfront. I thought, too, of those nameless swimmers I had seen, counting the parties so far glimpsed, as well as those presumably covering other roads. The numbers of my pursuers must be strangely large for a town as depopulated as Innsmouth. Who were they? Why were they here? And if such a column as them was scouting the Ipswich Road, would the patrols of other roads be likely augmented? I had entered the bush-grown cut and was struggling along at a very slow pace when that damnable fishy odor again waxed dominant. There were sounds too, a kind of wholesale colossal flopping or pattering, which somehow called up images of the most detestable sort. And then both stench and sound grew stronger, so that I paused, shivering and grateful for the cut's protection. It was here, I recalled, that the Rowley Road drew so close, in the old railway before crossing westward and diverging. Something was coming along the road, and I must lie low till its passage, and vanishment in the distance. Crouching in the bushes of that sandy cleft, I felt reasonably safe, even though I knew the searchers would have to cross the track in front of me. Not much more than 100 yards away, I would be able to see them, and they could not, except by malign miracle, see me. All at once, I began dreading to look at them as they passed. I saw the close moonlit space where they would surge by, and had curious thoughts about the irredeemable pollution of that space. They would perhaps be the worst of all Innsmouth type. Something one would not care to remember. Stench waxed overpowering, and the noise swelled to a bestial babble of croaking, baying, and barking without the least suggestion of human speech. Were these indeed the voices of my pursuers? That flopping or pattering was monstrous. I could not look upon the degenerate creatures responsible for it. I would keep my eyes shut till the sounds receded towards the west. The horde was very close now. The air fell with their hoarse snarlings, and the ground almost shaking with their alien rhythmed footfalls. My breath nearly ceased to come, and I put every ounce of my willpower into the task of holding my eyelids down. I am not even yet willing to say whether what followed was a hideous actuality or only a nightmare hallucination. The latter action of the government, after my frantic appeals, would tend to confirm it as a monstrous truth. But could not a hallucination have been repeated under the quasi-hypnotic spell of that ancient, haunted and shadowed town? But I must try to tell what I thought I saw that night under the mocking yellow moon. Saw surging and hopping down Rowley Road, in plain sight, in front of me, as I crouched among the wild bramble of that desolate railway cut. Of course, my resolution to keep my eyes shut had failed. It was foredooming to fail, for who could crouch blindly while a legion of croaking, baying entities of unknown source flopped noisomely past, scarcely more than 100 yards away. For I knew that a long section of them must be plainly in sight, where the sides of the cut flatten out and the road crosses the track. I could no longer keep myself from sampling whatever horror that leering yellow moon might have to show. It was the end, for whatever remains of me, of life on the surface of this earth, of every vestige of mental peace and confidence in the integrity of nature and the human mind. Can it be possible that this planet has actually spawned such things? That human eyes have truly seen, as objective flesh, what man has hitherto known only in terrible fantasy or tenuous legend? And yet I saw them in a limitless stream, flopping, hopping, croaking, bleeding, surging inhumanly through the spectral moonlight in a grotesque, malignant saraband of fantastic nightmare, and some of them had tall tiaras of that nameless, whitish gold metal, and some were strangely robed. One who led the way was clad in ghoulishly humped-backed black coat and striped trousers, and had a man's felt hat perched on the shapeless thing that answered for a head. I think their predominant color was grayish-green, though they had white bellies. They were mostly shiny and slippery, but the ridges of their backs were scaly. Their forms vaguely suggested anthropod, while their heads were the heads of fishes with prodigiously bulging eyes that never closed. At the side of their necks were palpable gills. Their long paws were webbed. They hopped irregularly, sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes on 4. I was somehow glad that they had no more than 4 limbs. Their croaking, baying voices, clearly used for articulate speech, held all the dark shades of expression which their staring faces lacked. But for all of their monstrousness, they were not unfamiliar to me. I knew too well what they must be, for Was not the memory of that evil tiara at Newburyport still fresh? They were the blasphemous fish frogs of that nameless design, living and horrible, and I saw them. I knew also of what that humped tiaraed priest in the Black Church basement had so fearsomely reminded me of. Their number was past guessing. It seemed to me that they were limitless swarms of them, and certainly my momentary glimpse would have shown only the least fraction. In another instant, everything was blotted out by a merciful fit of fainting. First I had ever had. Alright, that was chapter 4, and I do believe chapter 5 is the last of this book. We only have about 4 pages of this PDF left. So I am going to take a short break. I'll see you soon. All right, I am back, and we are almost done with the story. We're actually making quite good time on it. I might do a little bonus stream after the end of this. Let's see. Chapter 5. It was a gentle daylight rain that awakened me from my stupor in the brush growth railway cut. And when I staggered out to the roadway ahead, I saw no trace of any priests in the fresh mud. Innsmouth's ruined roofs and toppled steeples loomed up grayly towards the southeast, but not a living creature did I spy in all the desolate salt marshes around. My watch was still going and told me the hour was past noon. The reality of what I had been through was highly uncertain in my mind, but I felt that something hideous lay in the background, and I must get away from evil-shadowed Innsmouth, and accordingly, I began to test my cramped, wearied powers of locomotion. Despite weakness, hunger, horror, and bewilderment, I found myself after a time to be able to walk, so started slowly along the muddy road to Rowley. Before evening, I was in the village getting a meal and providing myself with presentable clothes. I caught the night train to Arkham, and the next day talked long and earnestly with government officials there. A process I later repeated in Boston. With the main result of these colloquies, the public is now familiar, and I wish, for normality's sake, there were nothing more to tell. Perhaps it is madness that is overtaking me, yet perhaps a greater horror or a greater marvel is reaching out. I dare not look for that piece of strange jewelry said to be in the Miskatonic University Museum. I did, however, improve my stay in Arkham by collecting some genealogical notes I had long wished to possess. Very rough and hasty data, it is true, but capable of good use later on, when I might have time to collate and codify them. The curator of the Historical Society there, Mr. E. Lapham Peabody, was very courteous about assisting me and expressed unusual interest when I told him I was the grandson of Eliza Orne of Arkham, who was born in 1867 and had married James Williamson of Ohio at age 17. It seemed that a maternal uncle of mine had been there many years before on a quest much like my own, and my grandmother's family was a topic of some local curiosity. There had, Mr. Peabody said, been considerable discussion about the marriage of her father, Benjamin Orne, just after the Civil War, since the ancestry of the bride was peculiarly puzzling. That bride was understood to have been an orphaned Marsh of New Hampshire, a cousin of Essex County Marshes, but her education had been in France and she knew very little of her family. A guardian had deposited funds in a Boston bank to maintain her and her French governess, but that guardian's name was unfamiliar to Arkham people, and in time he dropped out of sight, so that the governess assumed the role by court appointment. The French woman, now long dead, was very taciturn, and there were those who said she could have told more than she did. Ah, summertime. Welcome in. I'm glad you like the ambiance in my reading room. How have you been? We are just finishing up with Shadow over Innsmouth, the last few pages right now. You'll have to catch the rest in the VOD, but in summary, although I don't know how much you heard from, was it Monday? Monday's stream, when I started. The narrator has been chased out of Arkham. He was able to, not Arkham, sorry, Innsmouth. I know so little short stories for the redeemed. Oh, no problem at all. But yes, the narrator was chased out of Innsmouth and was able to escape a horde of people and things, and has spoken with various government officials. You listened to a lot of it on Monday. Good, good. So that was part one. And, so yes, he was chased out of town. Now this is sort of an epilogue of him talking about the rest of his journey through New England the same year. And he is now talking with a genealogist or historian of some kind about his own ancestry. But the most baffling thing was the inability of anyone to place the recorded parents of the young woman, Enoch and Lydia Marsh, along with known families of New Hampshire. Possibly, many suggested, she was the natural daughter of some Marsh of prominence. She certainly had the true Marsh eyes. Most of the puzzling was done after her early death, which took place at the birth of my grandmother, her only child, having formed some disagreeable impressions connected with the name of Marsh. I did not welcome the news that had belonged on my own ancestral tree, nor was I pleased by Mr. Peabody's suggestion that I might had the true Marsh eyes myself. However, I was grateful for data which I knew would prove valuable, and took copious notes and lists of books references regarding the well-documented Orne family. I went directly home to Toledo from Boston, and later spent a month at the Maumee, recuperating from my ordeal. In September, I entered Oberlin for my final year. and from then till next June was busy with studies and other wholesome activities, reminded of the bygone terror only on occasional official visits from government men and connections with the campaign which my pleas in evidence had started. Around the middle of July, just a year after the Innsmouth experience, I spent a week with my late mother's family in Cleveland, checking some of my new genealogical data with the various notes, traditions, and bits of heirloom material in existence, and seeing what kind of connected chart I could construct. I did not exactly relish the task, for the atmosphere of the Williamson home had always depressed me. There was a strain of morbidity there, and my mother had never encouraged my visiting her parents as a child, although she always welcomed her father when he came to Toledo. My Arkham-born grandmother had seemed strange and almost terrifying to me, and I do not think I grieved when she disappeared. I was 8 years old then, and it was said that she had wandered off in grief after the suicide of my Uncle Douglas, her eldest son. He had shot himself after a trip to New England, the same trip, no doubt, which had caused him to be recalled at the Arkham Historical Society. My uncle had resembled her, and I never liked him either. Something about his staring, unwinking expression of both of them had given me a vague, unaccountable uneasiness. My mother and Uncle Walter had not looked like that, and they were like their father through poor little cousin Lawrence. Walter's son had been an almost perfect duplicate of his grandmother before her condition took him to permanent seclusion at the sanitarium in Canton. I had not seen him for 4 years, but my uncle once implied that his state, both physical and mental, was very bad. This worry had probably been a major cause of his mother's death 2 years before. Need another drink of water. My grandfather and his widowered son, Walter, now comprised the Cleveland household, but the memory of older times hung thickly over it. I still disliked the place, and tried to get my researches done as quickly as possible. Williamson records and traditions were supplied in abundance by my grandfather through though for Orne material, I had to depend on my Uncle Walter, who put at my disposal the contents of all of his files, including notes, letters, cuttings, heirlooms, photographs, miniatures. It was in going over the letters and pictures on the Orne side that I had begun to acquire a kind of terror for my own ancestry. And, as I have said, my grandmother and Uncle Douglas had always disturbed me. Now, years after their passing, I gazed at their pictured faces with a measurably heightened feeling of repulsion and alienation. I could not at first understand the change, but gradually a horrible sort of comparison began to obtrude itself on my unconscious mind, despite the steady refusal of my consciousness to admit even the least suspicion of it. It was clear that the typical expression of these faces now suggested something it had not suggested before, something which would bring stark panic if openly thought of. But the worst shock came when my uncle showed me one of the Orn jewelry in a downtown safe deposit vault. Some of the items were delicate and inspiring enough, but there was one box of strange old pieces descended from my mysterious great-grandmother, which my uncle almost reluctantly provided. There were, he said, a very grotesque and almost repulsive design. As my uncle began to slowly and grudgingly unwrap the things, he urged me not to be too shocked by the strangeness and frequent hideousness of the designs. There were 2 armlets, a tiara, and a kind of pectoral, the latter having in high relief certain figures of almost unbearable extravagance. He seemed to expect some demonstration when, in first piece, the tiara became visible, but I doubt if he had expected quite what actually happened. I did not expect it either, for I thought I was thoroughly forewarned regarding the jewelry, or what the jewelry would turn out to be. What I did was to faint silently, away just as I had done in the briar-choked railway cut a year before. From that day on, my life has been a nightmare of brooding and apprehension, nor do I know how much is hideous truth and how much is madness. My great-grandmother had been a marsh of unknown source, whose husband lived in Arkham, and did not old Zadok say that the daughter of Obed Marsh was a monstrous mother who married to an Arkham man through a trick? What was it the ancient toper had muttered about the likeness of my eyes to Captain Obed's? In Arkham 2, the curator had told me I had the true Marsh eyes. Was Obed Marsh my own great-great-grandfather? Who or what, then, was my great-great-grandmother? Or perhaps this was all madness. Those white gold ornaments might easily have been bought from some Innsmouth sailor by my father of my great-grandmother, whoever he was. And that look of the staring faces of my grandmother and self-slain uncle might be sheer fancy, bolstered by the Innsmouth shadow which had darkly colored my imagination. But why had my uncle killed himself after an ancestral quest in New England? For more than 2 years, I fought off these reflections with partial success. My father secured me a place for an insurance office, and I buried myself in routine as deeply as possible. In the winter of 1930 to 31, however, the dreams began. They were very sparse and insidious at first, but increased in frequency and vividness as the weeks went by. Great watery spaces opened out before me, and I seemed to wander through titanic sunken porticos and labyrinths of weedy cyclopean walls and grotesque fishes as my companion. Then the other shapes began to appear, filling me with a nameless horror the moment I awoke. But during those dreams, they did not horrify me at all. I was one of them, wearing their unhuman trappings, treading their aqueous ways, praying monstrously at their evil sea-bottom temples. There was much more than I could remember, but even what I did remember each morning would be enough to stamp me as a madman or a genius if I ever dared to write it down. Some frightful influence I felt, was seeking gradually to drag me out of the sane world of wholesome life into unnameable abysses of blackness and alienage, and the process told heavily on me. My health and appearance grew steadily worse till finally I was forced to give up my position and adopt the static, secluded life of an invalid. Some odd, nervous affliction had me in its grasp, and I found myself at times almost unable to shut my eyes. It was then I began to study the mirror with mounting alarm. The slow ravages of disease are not pleasant to watch, but in my case there was something subtler and more puzzling in the background. My father seemed to notice it too, for he began looking at me with curiosity and almost affrightedly. What was taking place in me? Could it be I was coming to resemble my grandmother and Uncle Douglas? One night, I had a frightful dream in which I met my grandmother under the sea. She lived in a phosphorescent palace with many terraces, with gardens of strange, leprous corals and grotesque, branchite efflorescences, and welcomed me with a warmth that may have been sardonic. She had changed, as those who take to the water change, and told me she had never died. Instead, she had gone to the spot her dead son had learned about, and leapt into a realm whose wonders were destined for him as well. He had spurned with a smoking pistol. This was to be my realm too. I could not escape it. I would never die, but would live with those who had lived since before man ever walked the earth. We get a little picture that was made for the original printing of this story, which was in the magazine Strange Tales. I met also that which had been her grandmother for 80,000 years. Athaliah had lived in Yathni, and thither she had gone back after Obed Marsh was dead. Yathni was not destroyed when the upper earthmen trot down into the sea. It was hurt, but not destroyed. The deep ones could never be destroyed. Even those paleogenic magic of the forgotten old ones might sometimes check them, for the present would never rest. But someday, if they remembered, they would rise again for the tribute great Cthulhu craved. It would be a city greater than Innsmouth next time. They had planned to spread, and had brought up that which would help them, but now they must wait once more for bringing the upper earth's men's death. I must do penance. But this would not be heavy. This was a dream in which I saw a Shoggoth for the first time, and the sight sent me awake in a frenzy of screaming. That morning, the mirror definitely told me I had acquired the Innsmouth look. So far, I have not shot myself as Uncle Douglas did. I bought an automatic and almost took the step, but certain dreams deterred me. These tense extremes of horror are lessening, and I feel queerly drawn towards the unknown sea depths. Instead of fearing them, I hear and do not strange things. I hear and do strange things in sleep, and awake with a kind of exaltation instead of terror. I do not believe I need to wait for the full change, as most have waited. If I did, my father would probably shut me up in a sanitarium as my poor little cousin is shut. Stupendous and unheard of splendors await me below. I shall seek them soon. Ia R'lyeh, Cthulhu Fhtagn. Ia. No, I shall not shoot myself. I cannot be made to shoot myself. I shall plan my cousin's escape from the Canton madhouse, and together we shall go to marvel shadowed Innsmouth. We shall swim out to that brooding reef in the sea and dive down through black abyss to Cyclopean and many column Yah Nui. In that lair of deep ones, we shall dwell amidst wonder and glory forever. And thus concludes Shadow over Innsmouth by H.P. Lovecraft. Ah. All right. So yeah, as I mentioned, today and yes, last time that I read, on Monday, Shadow over Innsmouth, definitely of the two most influential Lovecraft stories, along with Call of Cthulhu, which the very famous RPG system is named. That system, it's hard to call it a rival of D&D. D&D is certainly more popular, especially here in the West. But I was actually reading earlier this year about its popularity in Japan. I was always vaguely aware of its popularity there, but I was not aware of just how popular it was among people who play role-playing games there. It's actually far more popular than D&D. In addition to that, of course, there have been video games based on Shadow over Innsmouth. The deep ones who are mentioned here, as well as, Cthulhu, but that's also from Call of Cthulhu. Probably the most well-known, aspect of the Lovecraft mythos, if you want to call it that. Let's see. Yes. There were a lot of aspects of this story that I actually really like. I love the introduction, which we went over yesterday. They talk about the afterwards events that are happen in between him escaping Innsmouth and him learning of his ancestry. I really like that segment because it really sets up the government is taking this seriously, and even trying to see where it was, but it was talking about even journalists and complaints from many liberal organizations were met with confidential discussions, and representatives were taken on trips to certain camps and prisons. As a result, these societies became surprisingly passive and reticent. And a bunch of the other stuff early on. I really like that. I really like him going to Newburyport and seeing the tiara. I do like, to some extent, him going over his own ancestry at the end. I thought the writing for that was particularly good, in terms of setting up his reactions to things. I do think it could have been maybe trimmed a little better, or maybe they could have made... I was going to say made, like, the people in it, like, a little bit more clear, but actually I think they did an okay job of that. Let's see. Where the story really dragged for me was the stuff we covered at the end of Monday's stream, where it's Zadok, I believe is his name, the old drunk man. I checked the VOD, and that segment went on for something like 40 minutes of just him monologuing, and both his, like, patois that he's written with is nigh impenetrable, very difficult to read aloud, and also, I don't know, it just, there are good aspects about it. It sets up the mythos of where did all of this come from, what did Captain Obed do, things like that. It gives it enough of room of just saying, this is just a crazy guy's fantasy for where it is in the book. But man, could it have been shorter. I also think the segment in the hotel where he's escaping definitely should have been changed. There's a lot of, I went through the north room and then there were the doors here, and I did this and this to them. I looked out the window and in this direction was this. And I don't feel like it was written... It's written in a way that I would have to actually make a map as I am reading through it to understand where things are, and also several things get repeated over and over. I don't like that. But overall, definitely one of his good ones. Summertime says, oh, I like it when books have you taking notes like that. Sometimes I like it when books have me taking notes like that, but when I have to do it to actually process what it's trying to tell me, especially in an action scene, that's a problem. That's a problem in my mind, at least. Let's see. As far as our typical topic when going over these Lovecraft stories, the problematic elements, sure, there's stuff early on, especially when people are talking about Innsmouth folk. It's written in the language of racism, and it's actually said out loud by one of the ticket agents or something. Yeah, you know, what everyone's saying is just racism. But by the way, I'm also racist. Like, he just says it. Honestly, I don't think that's a bad thing, because in that instance, it's just describing people who are racist and acting like racists. You can say that there's a meta element there that's a problem of these people are racist and then proved right, but I don't know how I feel about going down that track. Summertime says, have you read House of Leaves? I've seen people calling that book PvP. I know exactly what you mean. I have read only passages from Book of Leaves. I do want to read it at some point. I wonder if it would make for good reading on stream. It is certainly not a typical reading experience. As for going back to what I was intending to say, I think maybe they're, like, you can pick apart specific things that Zadok says about, what was I trying to say? Yeah, Zadok says some pretty racist stuff about Southern Islanders. Um, that's kind of in the same vein as what I was saying about the people talking about Innsmouth folk, of he's just being racist. But I think there is definitely some level of, from the narration standpoint and metatextual elements, I'm having trouble, like, specifically pointing to anything. It just feels off. Not as bad as I've seen in some other books, though. I will say that. Some other books of Lovecraft. The one thing that really stands out to me, though, is something that a friend once said about this book, about the specific final chapter where he's doing his genealogical studies and learns that he is, descended from the Innsmouth people, descended from the old ones specifically, which is, it read to them, they were looking into the race science that was getting popular in the 1920s and 1930s, like reading about that sort of thing was, spoke to them of how people were thinking back then. It's not unrelated to phrenology, but it isn't phrenology itself. It's more the race sciences of I'm trying to think of specifics, like people old-timey style investigating, like, do they have a, like, hinge of Jewish ancestry or something, and that was actually a big fear of some white people back then, that they were secretly Jewish or something like that. Phrenology is kind of related to that topic because some people used phrenology, which is the study of the shape of bones, specifically the skull, to figure out what race people were. I don't think, according to phrenology, they could use that to determine if a white person was Jewish, though. They purported to be able to tell if a white person was, like, secretly black or something like that. Summertime says, all the resources wasted on so-called science, man, it's wild. Absolutely. Like the lengths they went to hate even more crazy shit. Absolutely true. And you want to know the strangest thing of all? At the time, the people who were on the forefront of these things, some people whose names you would actually recognize, like H.G. Wells, they actually believed that they were being very liberal in doing these things. Because prior to that, race was deemed to be, how do I put it, like a spiritual thing rather than a physical, scientific thing. And so when trying to categorize it as a physical, like biological thing, it's taking away power from people who were saying, black people deserve to be slaves because they are spiritually impure and that can never be changed, or things like that. Or not never be changed, but that God determined that they should be black because they're spiritually impure. Was a big argument prior to all of this. But yes, no matter what they were thinking, it's all very crazy shit. Well, as much as I like talking about the past, I'd much rather find something else to talk about at the moment. Let me bring us back to the Yap screen. Oh, and get rid of the stream schedule. But yes, we made pretty good time. It's still prior to midnight for me. You know what? I am going to test something while I have you all here. Let me get something running up in the background. It will be just a moment. I'll take us to the BRB screen while I do this. So everyone grab yourself a drink, something to eat, or head to the bathroom if you need.